Welcome, beloveds, to our weekly Nurture the Soul series. I am Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I'm your host today. I am also the Minister for Congregation and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team, and we are part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. I use they, them pronouns, and today I still have a pixie blonde haircut, and I'm wearing a gray blouse with multicolored clay-made earrings from a local artist. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with a multitude of practical, educational, innovative, and formational resources to engage with the critical topics facing our communities right now. This webinar centers curiosity and care towards the collective liberation for all of God's creation. We feature guest theologians, preachers, authors, community members, cultural artists, and thought leaders to delve deeply into the topics that help us live into a gospel for such a time as this. Beloveds, we hope that this virtual space is a space for connection, one that cultivates a curious and loving community, because we believe that these are key in the journey alongside our still speaking God. And so we invite you to join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul, and from time to time, look for special offerings. You can find a full list of all of our upcoming digital program offerings at ucc.org/events, or of course, on any of our social media platforms. Today and all of our Nurture the Soul webinars are recorded, and the link will be sent out within 72 hours, or you can always view the complete Nurture the Soul playlist on our YouTube page at the link that will be provided into chat. If you are interested in participating or have an idea or a topic that you would like to see, please feel free to reach out to me via the email address that was used to remind you of today's webinar. And beloveds, if the conversations that you hear in this virtual space, if what's offered helps to enhance your ministry or nurtures your soul, we hope that you consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ. And you can do this by texting the letters UCC to the numbers 41444. These small tokens have huge impacts in helping us to resource you and your community in innovative and engaging ways. We want to thank you for supporting us, and thank you so much for being with us today. Before I introduce this week's guests, I'd like to remind you to use the chat feature to share where it is that you're zooming in from and to continue the conversation amongst each other. And we invite you to use the Q&A feature to ask a specific question, as we will have time at the end of this webinar to delve into some of those questions. You can find the chat and Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And the icon, they both look like a dialogue bubble. One has a question mark for the Q&A, and the other one has 3 dots or the ellipses for the chat. And now, beloveds, I'd love to welcome you back for part 3 of this 3-part series. I'm sad to say this is our final part, but I pray and hope that the participants would love to join us again in the future. We are joined by the leaders and the trailblazers of this Afro-Christian convention. And so I invite Julia, Henry, and Mother Delk onto the screen. Julia will again be hosting and moderating the conversation today. And I get to join in at the end to bring forth your questions. And so, beloveds, I do want to remind you to please use the Q&A feature if a question comes up that you would like to ask our presenters. And I invite you to also share a story in the Q&A if something that you would like us to read out loud. I can't promise that I'll read everything that is shared, but I will do my best, because we're trying to make it as interactive as possible in this virtual platform in the way that we have it set up. But your voice is vital, and we are so blessed that you are here to join us. Julia, I get to turn it over to you and continue to sit back and bask in the wisdom that is here in this space. Thank you for leading us in conversation.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm so glad to be back again. Nurturing the soul is a spiritual practice that must begin by affirming the sacrality of life and its connection to the Creator. It was this understanding of the divine-human relationship that shaped the worldview for Afro-Christians, who offered us the spirit of Ubuntu that says, I am because we are. Since we are, therefore I am. During the past 2 weeks, we have examined dignity as the divine right of all humanity and compassion as the radical act of suffering and struggling together. In each case, the testimonies of the elders affirm the spirit of Ubuntu as a powerful foundation for resilience, resistance, and restoration. Today, we will end the series by considering co-responsibility as the link between dignity and compassion that can prepare us for transformative acts of justice for such a time as this. Co-responsibility, simply defined, is the act of working together for collective well-being, and it is the essence of Ubuntu. So Mother Delk and Reverend Simmons, as each of you reflect on the Afro-Christian story and your own life, identify one important moment of truth-telling when co-responsibility inspired by Ubuntu resulted in an act of resistance in the midst of injustice. Mother Delk, I invite you to begin.
Well, welcome to everybody again. It's so good to be back into this third part. Can't believe that the time has gone by so fast. Sorry I wasn't with you the last time, but I was so pleased with Henry and Julia, who carried the baton straightly on. As I think about the question that Julia has proposed to me, I think about what has enabled me to keep moving on and pressing on. I think about that which has allowed my soul to be nurtured and empowered. And a part of it is words that were spoken over me and around me and through me. And those words were, never forget who you are or whose you are. Don't forget who you are or whose you are. And in the chapter that I wrote in the book, and by the way, I hope all of you are purchasing the book, encouraging others to get the book, because that tells the story even more than we can in this period of time. But I begin my chapter by saying this: to remember who you are and whose you are. It's to define who you are in ways that we just are not free to walk away from. To remember is a sacred liturgy that grounds us and equips us with an identity and a meaning and purpose. And it connects us to the Ubuntu narrative. It connects us to all of life, the living and the dead, and the yet to be born. And that was important for me because it would center me as I navigated my way through a system that was determined to dehumanize and deny my essential worth and value as a person. And the words were also a reminder that I had a responsibility in what I did and how I did it to pave the way for others who were around me and who would be coming after me. That I was a part of a story that connected me to the mothers and fathers who made the way for me coming out of enslavement, and through the Afro-Christian Convention, who breathed life into me. And I had the responsibility, when called upon, to do the same. And one of those times that I remember is the year 1969. It was the year that I entered the national staff of the United Church of Christ. I had been hired then to serve as the secretary for Black and Urban Education and the Division of Christian Education, which was a part of the Board for Homeland Ministries. And in 1969, at that Senate that would be held in Boston, Massachusetts, I would be introduced to the whole Senate by Howard Sprague, who in fact was the head of the Board for Homeland Ministries. As I thought about that moment, I in fact now look back on how it was very interesting that here I was, a daughter of the Afro-Christian Convention, getting ready to be introduced to the United Church of Christ at its national level. And that same national level would look at the church that I came from and many of the other Afro-Christian churches as objects of its mission and not subjects of its mission. So it was going to be very interesting to me how I was going to be introduced and presented to that Senate. I was sure that when Howard Sprague introduced me, it would not include my roots in Macedonia. It wouldn't say much about Franklinton Center at Bricks, actually nothing about it. But I would be introduced from the lens of my position and my title. The day that I checked into Park Plaza Hotel, where the Senate was going to be held, I could still feel those words around me. Never forget who you are and whose you are. I could even hear Reverend W.H. Thomas, who was a rural pastor of 4 churches in North Carolina, saying to me, Yvonne, when you get up there to national, don't forget us, don't forget us. He had a responsibility. He was planting in my mind and my spirit a responsibility that there was something deeper that I had to be about than the words that Howard Sprague would speak. I represented a narrative of a people who had fought for freedom and justice and liberation, and how I entered this national setting was going to be important. It would define me in the context of a movement for justice and liberation. Well, the movement and the moment of truth and truth-telling came when Bill Land walked up to me as I was checking in. Now, I would discover later that Bill was with the Committee for Racial Justice. So Bill introduced himself to me and indicated that he was with the staff of racial justice. And I said to him, well, I am just called upon myself to be a staff of the Board for Homeland Ministry, and I'm going to be introduced to the Senate. Bill Land said, be that as it may. That's an interesting piece there. Be that as it may. He said, there is something going on in this Senate that you need to be aware of. He gave me a flyer, and it was about a meeting that would be held that night. And he said, as a Black person, I think you might want to be at that meeting. I thought that was interesting too. He felt it was important for me to at least be centered in something more than my being introduced by title and position by Howard Sprague. That night I went to the meeting, and again, as I sat there, the words were echoing over and over again. Don't forget now who you are and whose you are. As I sat in that meeting, I realized that something important was going to happen at that Senate that would take place the next day. There were representatives in that meeting from Ministers for Racial Justice, and they were planning to interrupt the agenda of the Senate. No more business as usual. And that next morning, when all the delegates and everybody else gathered for that General Senate, they intended to take charge of the Senate. They would move down the aisle of that Senate and demand that an injunction be lifted from one James Foreman and that he be granted permission to speak. Now, that's not how I thought of myself entering that General Senate. I had thought of myself entering General Senate, sitting in some special place, and then having Howard Sprague wonderfully introducing me to the Senate. But the call on me at that moment was to decide how I, in fact, intended to move. Was I moving with a title or position, or was I going to enter with a movement for justice? I had a responsibility, a co-responsibility, to, in fact, stand on the ground that had given life and spirit to me. So it really wasn't a real charge or a real wrestling with me to decide what I would do. I knew that next moment, when the sisters and the brothers gathered around James Foreman, that I, in fact, would be in that number, and that I, in fact, would move into that Senate, not as a privileged person, but as a person connected to the movement for justice and wholeness and freedom, a movement that would even call into question the very national staff and the very Senate that I was going to be a part of. James Foreman, some of you may know his name, and it was interesting that James Foreman, which was a prophet, I call him a prophet of truth and justice, had been turned away a couple of days before, because he arrived at our national offices to speak with our elected leaders, and he had a message to confront this church, and to confront it by saying that the white church is part and parcel of the fabric of racism and capitalism, and that it had a debt it owed. He came calling for reparations. He came with a Black Manifesto. The main text of the Black Manifesto called for reparations to Blacks and the modest sum of $5 million to be paid by white Protestant and Catholic churches and the Jewish synagogues of America. Our response to James Foreman when he arrived at Park Avenue South was to block him from entering. We not only blocked him from entering, we took out an injunction against him, banning him from entering Park Avenue South. However, Charlie Cobb decided that, in fact, this denomination would not ignore one of the prophets that carried our story. This denomination would not ignore one who had come to call it into accountability for its complicity in racism. And with a clear voice, and surrounded by sisters and brothers who at that time with Mrs. J, were both Black and white, had decided that their humanity and the Ubuntu understanding of humanity required that they stand boldly with this denomination for being able to, in fact, not only hear, but to respond to the injustices that have occurred in our land. So that next morning, I got up early, called my mama. She prayed with me and over me, and joined the other sisters and brothers who, in fact, walked that aisle. I can see us now as we move down the aisle of that General Senate, predominantly white, but moving down that aisle with a church that had come into being in order not only to be uniting bodies of faith together, but had come into being because it had declared that it wanted to heal some of the brokenness that existed in our nation, to bring us together across the boundaries. And yet here was a moment when pushed that it responded by blocking that voice from being heard. We walked down the aisle, took possession of the stage, and I knew that for me, this was the way I wanted to be introduced to this United Church of Christ, not by the title or position that Howard Sprague was going to offer, but as a part of a movement, an Ubuntu movement that would be standing for justice and wholeness and declaring that this church listen and hear. Ed Edmonds moved to the microphone. Ed Edmonds, which was the chair of Mrs. J, and in fact, stated boldly, this Senate will not begin until the officers move to, in fact, lift the injunction against James Foreman. Charlie had always said, we have the proclivity to do right when pushed, and this was a pushing moment. And so we sang freedom songs while the executive council and the leaders moved in order to be able to get the injunction lifted. We sang freedom songs. They were the same songs that I had sung many times ago on the freedoms, in freedom moments when we were moving for freedom and justice. It was freedom songs that Henry and I had learned at Franklinton Center when we were, in fact, being equipped for the freedom justice movement that was there. To know who you are and whose you are means that you have to be willing to stand for it, whatever the risk. I didn't know what would happen to me as a result of Howard Sprague seeing me up there, calling him into accountability rather than him introducing me to the General Senate. I didn't know what would follow after, but I did know this. I knew that I had a responsibility, was raised and equipped with the responsibility to a narrative that would require me to speak for that narrative, to witness for that narrative, and to, in fact, pay a cost, if need be, for that narrative. Ubuntu brings with it a way of living and being. What's interesting about this is that I was also a year before that in the very meeting that gave birth to the idea that we would confront our religious leaders for complicity and racism. So I was in the very meeting that gave birth to the strategy that was now being lived out by James Foreman. It was an important moment. They moved after a fashion. The whole Senate was singing freedom songs, etc., waiting for the next movement. So the Spirit has a way of moving in the midst of this. The word came back that the injunction had been lifted. James Foreman moved to the microphone and spoke to the entire Senate. It was a very important moment in the life of the Senate, and it was also a very important moment in my life. I realized then, as he spoke, that it is inherent upon each of us to decide how we enter, what narrative we enter around or in, what defines who we are, and ways that we simply are not free to walk away from. As I stood there, I could not know that just 6 months later, I would be asked to, in fact, speak at the inaugural celebration of the new president, because that Senate was the Senate that, in fact, Bob Moss was elected to head our denomination. And it was February that he would be installed. How would I know that my being bold enough to stand up there in front of everybody would open doors for me now to be asked to, in fact, charge the new president of the church in the context of our commitment for justice, wholeness in this nation? When you are willing to stand in the authority of who you are and whose you are, when you take the risk, even in the midst of it, it opens doors then for you to be defined as a part of a movement that is unfolding, and not just simply by title and position. When I charged the president 6 months later, I presented him with two symbols. The first symbol was, in fact, chains. And many of you, if ever saw the picture of Bob Moss standing, he's got chains hanging around his neck. I presented him with the chains as a symbol of that which holds us in captivity. Racism holds us in captivity, binds us down. Sexism holds us down. Classism, homophobia holds us in captivity. But I also presented him with something else. It was a picture that had been drawn by my colleagues in Christian education when I told them what I wanted to do as I came to that moment. It was the button that we had worn at that NCBC meeting that James Foreman was a part of and that developed in that strategy. The button was a fist holding the cross. The fist represented the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ to break through that which in fact holds us in captivity. The fifth wrote, there's power in the gospel. There's power in Ubuntu. There's power in the beloved community. There's power in us being able to stand as boldly as we can. I had a responsibility in that moment to decide not only who I was and whose I was, but whether I was willing to represent when the moment became real. I chose to represent, not in a title, not in a position, description, but as a part of a movement that was unfolding for justice. It would forever introduce me into this United Church of Christ at its national level. And in so doing, I felt I had represented well the Afro-Christian Convention, all the mothers and fathers who had made it possible for me to be who I was and where I was, and to be able to witness to another narrative than the narrative of hate and the narrative that would demean and dismiss me, but I would be able to live out a narrative of hope and the beloved community. It was how I entered the United Church of Christ at its national level and the power of Ubuntu and justice and freedom.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mother Dell, for that historic moment of truth-telling that was clearly an act of resistance inspired by Ubuntu. Thank you so much for that. Reverend Simmons, once again, can you share with us a moment of truth-telling from your experience that actually resulted in an act of resistance, particularly around the idea of co-responsibility?
Thank you, Julia. And first, let me say what a pleasure it is to share this seminar again with you, Julia, and Mother Yvonne, and all the others of our beloved United Church of Christ who are here today and have been here for the past couple of Wednesdays for nurturing our souls. Like Mother Yvonne, I was nurtured in that part of the Afro-Christian Convention that sponsored the Franklinton Center at Bricks. I would go there as a young person for the first time in 1961. And as Mother Yvonne has said earlier, we weren't there to necessarily sing the standard camp songs and so forth, but our music was that of the civil rights movement that was consuming the nation in a very positive way at that time. My story has to do with the summer of 1966. That summer, I had been given a scholarship by Dr. Purcell O. Alston, whom Mother Yvonne counts as a mentor, and who both of us would count as a father or parent in ministry. I was given a scholarship that would help me to attend my first year of college. The price I had to pay for that scholarship was to spend 9 weeks at a summer camp of the Southern Conference called Camp Moon Elon, which was located in Elon College, North Carolina, or on the outskirts of Elon College. And the reason that's significant is that the Southern Conference had just been formally organized in the summer of 1965, a year before, as a result of the merger of the former Southern Synod and the former Convention of the South. Both conferences in the new United Church of Christ, but they were racially segregated. So the importance of my going to work at Mooneylawn College or at Camp Mooneylawn near uh, Elon College was simply that someone had to do the work of initiating co-responsibility. And so often, as many of us my age and perhaps a little older would know, that those first steps often had to be taken by persons who were historically left out, looked over, and so forth. The real challenge was, how do you do that without compromising who you are and by not giving up in your spirit what the dedication and commitment required for such a noble cause. And so my work that summer was to stay at the camp. I didn't know a whole lot about camping, but I knew what I had learned at Franklinton Center. I said, so maybe this will work here. Unfortunately, of the 900 campers who came through the camp that summer for about 8 weeks, I was the only Black person, uh, except for the cooks and so forth in the kitchen. My work entailed working with the conference minister for Christian education, the Reverend Richard Dick Rinker. And my job was to go around with him as he went to do workshops at churches and so forth of the conference, and to just begin again to live into this beloved community, or beginning to form the beloved community. Well, needless to say, that was a challenge. I can recall at several churches that we visited where we had appointments set up. We would drive an hour or two, particularly to western parts of the state, and the churches would be closed. And the people were not there to meet with us. And we only surmised that was because it was really a challenge, even within the church, for persons to deal with the notion then of integration. Fast forward, also that summer, I participated in a summer youth caravan, which was a popular summertime activity in the United Church of Christ. And our summer youth caravan group would be composed of 3 young white ladies from our churches in the Southern Conference, 2 young Black females from the Eastern Eastern Virginia, Association, and myself. And we had 3 advisors. And we began on the campus of Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina, to make our way to the ultimate or the final destination, which was in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, at the Voluntary Service Center. Now, you have to keep in mind that this was in the mid-60s. And so beginning in the South and moving ourselves to the North as an interracial group was a real challenge or risky business. But we went because we believed that we were doing God's work. We were doing great things. So as a 17-year-old, I had to kind of steel my spirit, fall back on my roots in faith and what we had learned and been taught at Franklinton Center, but also through the lives of the Afro-Christian church, to understand that faith and action, witness, were not bifurcated, that there was no way of knowing, of demonstrating our faith than by, in fact, demonstrating it. So that week-long excursion was filled with a lot of learnings, not just for me and us, but I might say more so for the white young people who were on the trip. There were several times where we were met with the racism that existed within the society, but also within the church. On one occasion, the group was to have been hosted overnight by members of a local UCC church. The members came by, picked up the white folk, and all of us who were Black had to stay in the parsonage of the church. We made our way from Virginia, from Northern Virginia to the western part of Virginia to Woodstock, Virginia, where we were to just rest and talk and have a good time. And we went on a swimming trip to a local public pool. And as soon as we entered the pool, all of the white folk got out. The lifeguards came and closed the pool. And what was interesting about all of that was that as we went back to the church where we were to stay and to have meals, I cannot recall an actual conversation within the group about what had happened. And that was interesting because at each one of those stops or at every one of those experiences, there really wasn't a conscious attempt to dissect what had happened. Then I was suspect of that. But today I have a different sense about that. And that is the experience of the beloved community must be experienced. It is not an intellectual piece. Now, we did at the end of the trip have our debriefing session, but it was interesting for us to be allowed as young people of faith to sort it out amongst ourselves, to figure out what does this mean for us. We finally got to the Voluntary Service Center in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, did some work there. At the end of the trip, we did, as I said, dissect what had occurred. And there were several things that we as young people had discovered. And that is, we were being prepared through experience to pick up the baton and to move ahead with this not great experiment, but with this movement that would recognize the inherent dignity of others, but also to recognize that none of us can be who we are created to be without that sense of compassion, not pity, but compassion for one another and for all of us doing our particular part. 2 years later, in the spring of 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In 1969, the Reverend Dr. James Cone wrote his seminal book on Black theology and liberation. I was a first-year student at Howard University School of Religion, now Howard University Divinity School, in 1970. My systematic theological professor was the late Reverend Dr. James D. Otis Roberts, who, along with Dr. Cone, were considered the founders of the Black theology movement. The reason I'm sharing this is within 4 years of that experience of working as an interracial, quote unquote, integrated group, the call for persons of African ancestry to be more affirmatively excessive in our understanding of who we are had grown. And so a different sense of responsibility came. And some of us who are persons of African descent will understand this, that we cannot be all that God has called us to be by getting away from who we are, about moving away from our roots, but by embracing it and saying this is a precious gift to the whole. The Southern Conference in its early days, therefore, was a struggle. We would believe, or would tend to believe, that, the church would embrace all of the spirit and the dynamism of the civil rights movement and the movement for equality, but it was not the case. For those of us who were Black, we had to keep taking the steps to move the needle in terms of, combating racism and so forth. I might say, as I conclude this part of my remarks, that what we did to witness as young people, particularly those of us who were shaped and formed by Franklin-centered bricks, was less an act of resistance as it was an act of just plowing new ground, of saying this is the way we must move towards God's mandate for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-ending stream. It is interesting, as history and records indicate, that the full weight of racism that was moved aside slowly was done so by the women of the Women's Fellowship, quote unquote, of the Southern Conference, both Black and white, who were able to say, look, we've got to work together. This is a co-responsibility issue. And so with those persons leading us and with us young people seeking to live out what we had been nurtured in terms of our faith and spiritual development, we were able to move us to where we are now. And where we are now is in many ways beginning to resemble where we were 50 some odd years ago. Where we are now demands that those of us of faith develop the courage, the commitment, and the resolve of spirit to resist that which would divide and demean and debase, and to embrace that, boldly embrace that, which will mean an opportunity for all of God's people to fulfill their God giftedness. So my whole life beginning as a teenager, has been to fight for that which others may be reluctant to stand up for, but to fight and not even count the risk to one's self, but to count as important how one can stand before God and in the presence of one's neighbors with a sense that all of us, in fact, matter.
Thank you, Reverend Henry, for that wonderful, wonderful response. Co-responsibility as the act of working together for collective well-being is not easy. And you experience that very, very much so, particularly in a world of racial segregation. But you also know that the spirit of Ubuntu requires interaction that moves toward actual relationships through genuine compassion and dignity. So what we're going to do with the last few minutes we have left is take a look at that very thing. Mother Delk, I'd like for you to share a bit and say a little bit about how you see co-responsibility and dignity coming together to create a new level of restoration that heals and empowers across lines of differences.
Right. And I'm glad you said it's not always easy. One of the realities that I found myself wrestling with in the early periods was to stand my ground on racism, but not to make the connection to sexism, not to make the connections to homophobia, so I found myself fighting to defend anything that might be against racism, not realizing that I was betraying the understanding of Ubuntu, which basically said, it is my responsibility to see and connect to the injustices of all my sisters and brothers, however they enter. So that sexism was my issue. Fighting against sexism was my issue. I remember my being at the 1975 General Senate when the women's issue was the #1 issue for the denomination. I was up at the top of the bleachers of that Senate, unable to go down on the floor of that Senate when all of the women were rejoicing. I could see Valerie Russell down on that floor rejoicing. I could see Marilyn Brightland rejoicing. But I felt this denomination does not have the proclivity to hold into witness both racism and sexism. So at that moment in my head, I was thinking that now the light will be on sexism and away from. It won't connect the dots. The powers and principalities of injustice are united, but often we who are working for justice and wholeness, we tend to isolate where we are. The power of Ubuntu was to say, it was my issue that was being unfolding on the floor of that 75 Senate. My humanity was connected to the humanity of the sisters who were fighting and celebrating a breakthrough. It was my breakthrough too. I wasn't competing with them. It was connecting with them. And the issue that is important, I think, to Ubuntu is how we connect the dots to see that dignity means the dignity of all humanity. It was my ability to be able to define myself in relation to the women's movement. It was important for me to connect my dignity to the dignity of a Bill Johnson and all of the sisters and brothers who came out as LGBTQ and fought for their rights to be recognized in this denomination. I didn't have to compete with them. I was connecting with them. How we connect humanity, when you do that, the whole fire and the whole reality of how we move together grows with great intensity and grows with a great ability for us to, in fact, move further than we thought we might be able to do it. How we sit at the table is so important. How we understand our relationship to each other. It's sad to say that for the most part, we still are more divided than we are connected. And I think the call of Ubuntu for us right now is to connect the dots, to come together around a table where we yoke and stand together as we look at all of the ways that the system tries to divide us. Do not become so caught up in protecting your space that, in fact, we internalize the oppression ourselves by naming ourselves over and against one another. So what's critical about Ubuntu is that it allows us to define ourselves in relationship to each other. It's the African concept, all life is sacred. Any person whose humanity is being challenged, any attempt to demoralize us or any attempt to, in fact, make of a person anything less than who they are as the sons and daughters of God becomes our issue, because we're standing together to fight for a vision of a beloved community. And if ever there was a time that we need to connect our relationships to one another, this is the time. We are facing an autocracy now in which they are attempting to, in fact, challenge any amount of diversity, challenge any kind of reality that would allow us to be a beloved community. Our whole narrative is at work now. And so it's important for us as we stand, recognizing the dignity of every person, as we stand together, not separate and apart from each other, but standing strong in our belief of the narrative that is a narrative of justice and wholeness. And so my whole word to us right now is, let us not define ourselves over and against one another. Let us stand in solidarity with one another. Let us stand together as we fight against the injustices that are here. That's what Ubuntu is about. Having the ability for me to stand with you in dignity and to stand with all persons who find themselves oppressed by this system in dignity and compassion and in action for the world that we feel God intends. And so it is the continuing, I think, challenge for us is not to get isolated from one another, but to find ways that we can define ourselves in relationship to each other. That creates a fire, that creates a movement, that creates an ability for the world that we feel God intends. The powers and principalities of injustices are bold, and we got to be just as bold.
Thank you so much for that. Reverend Henry, as we come to a close, could you give a final word of encouragement or challenge for us today as we face what we are facing as a nation, as a church, and as individuals? A couple of words of encouragement and challenge.
My first word would be amen to what Mother Delk just said. The story is told of how Sojourner Truth, who was part of the abolitionists, the suffragist movement, and so forth, was giving a speech at a hall or a church in Ohio. She was discouraged because all of the work that she had been doing didn't seem to be paying off. There was this friction also amongst the Black women, the white women who were part of the suffragist movement and so forth. And as she gave her speech, she began to list all of the things that were so hard, all of the challenges and all of the difficulties they were facing. About 10 minutes into her speech, a voice rang out from the back of the room. shouting, "Sojourner, sojourner, is God dead?" And Sojourner took that word and it transformed her perception. It re-energized her. As difficult as these moments are, and as more difficult they're about to be, I would say that to us. I would ask that question to us in the United Church of Christ and to all other fellowships and communities of people who are labeled progressive or whatever. For us, it's just being who we are. But if you want to put the progressive label to it, is God dead? The United Church of Christ, in my humble estimation, based on its history, based on its resolve to stand for that which is just and right and true, is uniquely positioned to be a leading force in the movement against this autocracy, against the oligarchy, against all of this hatred, if we would understand that our name implicitly, if not explicitly, says united. That if we can develop the kind of mutual respect and compassion and dignity that Mother Delk just referenced, we're in a good position. Is it easy? No. Is it demanding? Yes. Is it necessary? Absolutely yes. We cannot forfeit what we believe within our souls to be right, to be just, on the basis of lies and deception and real intentionality to divide. We must be as intentional to unite, as intentional to bring us together, and as intentional to be the deliverers, the communicators of an alternate narrative. I'm no ways tired. That's Mother Del's person. We come too far from where we started from.
Yep.
As the old hymn says, nobody told us that the road would be easy.
No.
But we don't believe that God has brought us thus far to leave us. Our power is within that liberating gospel, within the image of that Christ who never gave up on the poor, the dispossessed, who never gave up on us. Our power does not reside at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
No, it doesn't.
Our power is within us to change what's happening there. So don't be discouraged. You know, God is great. I'll let Mother Del.
I just got to say this quickly before they talk up. Henry just inspired in me this piece that I want to say. Don't get distracted by the noise and the assembly. Don't get distracted by all of the realities that are unfolding right now. Stay on your watch. Stay in the place where we can continue to witness as boldly as we can. Do not fall into despair. I loved it when he invoked the name of Sojourner Truth. I got her right up here in my apartment, a huge statue that was given to me in the name of Sojourner Truth. But Sojourner Truth never got distracted from her goal of standing for the truth and witnessing for the truth. And I remember the story about Sojourner when they said she was going to deliver a speech in Indiana, and those old white supremacists and folk who were there sent a word to her. If you come to this place to speak, we will burn down the hall that you are to speak in. She said, burn the hall down. I will speak upon the ashes. Oh my goodness. When in the context of who we are, we stand boldly in the midst of all the nightmares and craziness that's happening. We stand in our narrative. We stand to witness for what we believe in. We stand with our LGBTQ sisters and brothers. We stand with those who are right now considered immigrants who have, in fact, no meaning, no worth, no dignity by those, but they are us. We stand in dignity with them. We stand for this beloved community. And now's our time to witness to it as bold as we can. Every church, every organization, all of us. Let our voices be heard. Let it be heard upon the ashes of that narrative that cannot last. It cannot last. But if we are willing to, in fact, give everything we've got in every place that we have to witness as boldly as we can, the beloved community will be a reality. Don't get distracted. Stay on your watch and watch what happens when together we are willing to witness to the beloved community that's in Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a way of living. It's a way of existing, especially in times like this. And so hopefully our souls can be nurtured by Ubuntu. Our souls can be nurtured when we define ourselves in relationship to each other and when we're willing to do whatever it takes to fight for the beloved community that God has given us. Don't get distracted. Stay on your watch.
Yo, I just walked to church, walked back to church, and went back again. I am so, so grateful for today. I would love to be able to turn this webinar into an every weekly series for any pastor that has to get ready to stand up in front of that pulpit on Sunday and deliver a message. Because I tell you what, this has given me inspiration to deliver messages in a different way to my own congregation. And so I am grateful for you, Julia, Mother Delk, and Henry, for all that it is that you are in the world. And I was going to jump in with a question that focused on embodiment, because as you all were sharing, I was very much thinking about where in my body where in your body were you feeling what you were feeling in those moments of when the pool closed down, when you were staring, when you were looking down upon the General Synod. Like, I wanted to know those things, but we had a question come into chat, and I think I want to divert that idea of where you felt it in your bodies, and you can elaborate if you want. But the question that came into chat or to the Q&A said, with the season of Lent upon us, how might we engage this season of going deep to activate the spirit of Ubuntu? I would love to hear the elders reflect on their own experiences of observing the Lenten period. And I feel like there is no better embodiment than what we have in Lent leading up to Pentecost.
I think one of the wonderful things about Franklin Center at Bricks right now is that it is spiritual ground. It is, in fact, place where we can go to, in fact, have our spirits renewed. And for me, knowing now that I am so deeply connected to Franklin Center, that's one of the places for me during this Lenten period where I will have my spirit nurtured. Because when I'm there, I am there connecting to the spirits of Native sisters and brothers who were on that land even before it was turned into a plantation. I feel their spirits there. It nurtures me. When I walk the Freedom Walkway and I look at the names that are there, when I think about their witness, when I think about how they, in fact, fought hard for the same vision, their heartbeat beats in my heart. Their spirits connects to my spirit. Their witness against injustice connects to me. And for me, it revitalizes my spirit. It revitalizes my spirit to be on sacred spiritual ground, where in fact I'm being fed by those who have come before me, enables my spirit to be strengthened in the midst of the struggle. So for me, being in a spirit-filled place, connecting to the mothers and fathers who have come before me, enables me then to continue to work for the vision that God has given, has put before us. And it's my heart that I feel. It's the heart when I'm standing before the General Synod and standing up on that stage, knowing that I'm beginning a journey into the life of this denomination. I won't be walking with my head alone. I'm walking with my heart. So I feel my heart beating. I feel my heart beating in the context of that moment, beating to enable me to be able to do the work that I need to do, the work that my soul's required. So for me, that part of my body is always the heart, my heart, that I, in fact, feel the sense of rhythm within the context of that which allows us to move and have our being. So Lenten for me is putting my mind, body, soul, and spirit into those places that can feed my spirit and therefore allow me then to grow stronger. And Ellie, it is always my heart that I ask, God, take my head, but also connect it to my heart. And that allows me then to keep walking in rhythm with the world that God intends.
Blessed be. Thank you, thank you, thank you. One final question. Where can people find you? Where are you showing up next? How can we support you and your journey? I know I'm going to either find you at Synod and or at Convocation in Atlanta shortly before. So you'll be seeing me again, Mother Delk. How about you, Julia and Henry? Where can folks find and support you?
At this point, like Mother Delk, I'm really tied to Franklinton Center at BRICS, and we would
Amen.
extend a standing invitation, but even with greater urgency now to come to that sacred space in Whitakers, North Carolina. It is a place where, in this day and age, that there is safety, that there is a sense of the sacred, that it's secure, that it is embracing of that which is bold. So you can contact me at Franklinton Center at BRICS. You will be hearing a lot more from us through our newsletter and other pieces. We probably will be at General Synod as well. But we'd love to have persons be on our newsletter, and we'll contact you, our mailing list, and we'll contact you, Reverend Ellie, for that. Big announcement, our next real big event is our annual Franklinton Center Day, which is always the first Saturday in August. It's a time for us to not only celebrate our history, the archives of the Afro-Christian Convention are now there, but it's a time for us to engage with one another in not just celebrating our victories, but also beginning to form partnerships and relationships to further that adventure along. So first Saturday in August, August 2nd, at Franklinton Center at BRICS. You'll hear more about it.
I'm still a member of the UCC Historical Council, and I'll be active and available and excited at Synod in July. You'll see me there.
Oh, Julia, good, good, good. I cannot wait to be in all of your presence in July, beloveds. And know that if you are watching this live, someone has shared this with you, or you are watching it later, Please pay attention to your email. A link will be sent out in a follow-up email with some resources. And we will also be sure to share or check it out on the Nurture the Soul playlist. You will be able to go to YouTube, type in Nurture the Soul, and by Monday, you'll be able to share this, rewatch it, or whatever, in case you lose that email. Or maybe we just all give up on email and go back to writing ourselves postcards and letters. Amen and hallelujah. I'd love for that day to come. Well, beloveds, I just want to thank you all for being a part of our 3-part conversation. It is with deep sadness that this is the final one, but so much deep gratitude for the time that we got to spend together. I want to thank you, presenters, Julia, for helping to moderate this amazing conversation. What a gift each and every one of you are to this world as you continue, and we all go forward to continue to care for all of God's creation. And we invite you back for a special offering on Monday, March 3rd at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a special What's Next series. And it's What's Next? Disarming Leviathan. Have we become entangled in the worship of nationalism and political power? This What's Next series began prior to the 2024 election and will continue throughout 2025 as a special offering that is designed to help educate and support the big questions of our faith. The series has been curated to push back on the political ideology and the divide that has become this nation's quote, end quote, religion. To live into our still speaking God, we are the embodiment of who and what we are called to be to one another, whether it be spiritually, faithfully, culturally, and lovingly during a time where we are being pulled apart. And so I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. And Mother Delk, I turn it back over to you for our benediction.
Well, Spirit of the living God, fall fresh. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us. Invoke the Spirit of Ubuntu to fall in us and through us, uniting us. Dignity, compassion, community, stronger than division and domination. Love is stronger than hate. Faith is stronger than fear. Truth-telling is stronger than lies. So lead us and guide us as we navigate our path through the madness of autocracy to the hope and promise of the beloved community. Let this be our prayer. As we go our way, lead us to a place. Guide us with your grace. Empower us with courage and strength so that we can run and not grow weary, walk and not faint. Grant us wisdom. Grant us courage. Grant us boldness for the facing of this hour. Spirit of the living God, fall fresh. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.